But we are going to have a nice civil discussion with our next guest. Karol Markowicz writes for the New York Post and Spectator US. She also appears on Fox quite a bit, and she's hilarious on Twitter, if I do say so myself. It's at Karol, Karol. But she always is holding Andrew Cuomo accountable. Karol, thank you so much for joining us on The Grace Curley Show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So, Karol, I first want to start off with your piece in The Spectator. You have a piece called The Vaccine Slow Roll, and you kind of describe how Ron DeSantis had his own issues, but he was treated very differently than New York Governor Andrew Cuomo. And can you explain what's happening in New York that isn't getting as much play as it should be?
So in New York, we've decided to reinvent the wheel. In Florida, they're vaccinating by age. In New York, we're trying to right all historical problems that we've had through the vaccine process, and that has proven to be kind of difficult. So in Florida, they've definitely had some hiccups, including that they were using just appointment systems that were difficult to use, and old people were showing up anyway, even without an appointment, and waiting on these really long lines. And the media loves long lines, so they were focusing on this and obviously saying what a terrible job Ron DeSantis is doing. But in New York, we only started vaccinating people 75 and over yesterday, and today they finally moved it to 65 and over because of the outcry. And we have just done such a terrible job of getting these vaccines into the arms of people who need them, who are at risk from this virus. And, you know, it's absolutely at Governor Cuomo's feet.
I guess a question that I have for you, because you do explain it in your piece, but the fining that Cuomo wanted to happen if things didn't go his way, he wanted to fine these hospitals. Can you explain to people what would warrant a fine from King Cuomo?
Right. So if you dared give a vaccine out of order, so if you reach the end of the day and you see you still have vaccines left, but there are no more people in the first group that you're supposed to be vaccinating waiting for a vaccine, he literally had vaccines thrown out instead of just giving them out of order to whoever wanted them. And it's really bizarre that he's treated as some sort of conquering hero when he's done things like this again and again to slow down the process of healing our state and making things better.
Yeah, and you make the remark in your column that on Tuesday, New York Times reporter J. David Goodman pointed out that fewer people were vaccinated in New York City this Monday than last Monday. And he
Right.
doesn't understand how that could be the case. And then I love the last line of your piece. You said, if the media could just pretend that Cuomo is a Republican, surely they'd get to the bottom of it.
Right. And that's part of the problem with having an activist media who are friends with Cuomo's brother and who look the other way as his brother interviewed him. My brother would also give me a softball interview if that was the case. But, you know, they don't call him on any of it. He hasn't had any adversarial interviews at all. When a reporter asks him an even mildly uncomfortable question, he flies off the handle and he gets to just coast. And so we're seeing sort of the end of that, where I think journalists are going to have no choice but to say, wait, he's not doing a good job here. These vaccinations are not happening. And he's trying to turn it around, and we'll see how that goes. Obviously, I'm rooting for him to turn it around because I want to see New Yorkers fully vaccinated, and I want to see this thing eradicated.
So, Karol, you also wrote a great piece. It was titled, Florida Puts New York to Shame in Rational Pandemic Policies. And you traveled to Florida for the first time. You were in New York for a long time, I'm assuming, and you left and went to Florida. And you describe that everyone was telling you before, oh, be careful, nobody wears masks in Florida.
Yeah.
You know, it's crazy there. And what did you actually see when you got to Florida?
Well, so in New York, we really have this image of Florida as the Wild West and how people are just, basically walking around licking each other. And it turned out not to be the case. So we landed at Palm Beach International, and it looked exactly like New York. Everybody's wearing a mask. Everybody's social distancing. There's hand sanitizer everywhere. And we found that to be the case everywhere we went in South Florida. People were absolutely careful. Nobody wants to get this thing, but it's different. It was different in Florida. It's different because in New York, it's very common to see people on an empty street or people nowhere near each other wearing masks. In Florida, that was far less common. And I think that kind of moderation actually helps because you can't wear a mask 24 hours a day. And so if you're wearing it in situations where you don't need it, you might be less likely to wear it in a situation where you do need it.
Right.
So Florida is setting the moderate example, and I think we should all follow it.
And I'm going to read from your piece here. You said the main difference, masks aren't worn in no-risk situations. In Gotham, I'm assuming that's New York City, it's very common to see people masked even when they are alone on empty streets. Small children wear masks outside. In Florida, we saw maskless children playing together outside. It looked like the before times, which is a good thing. We act like it's no big deal to wear masks, even where risk is non-existent. But of course, it does matter. Explain to people why it matters. Besides the point you just made about, wearing it so often that you stop wearing it. But there's also an emotional element of why it matters not to wear it when you're outside.
Yeah, so the next line there is that for the first time since April or so, we saw the smiling faces of strangers. It was jarring. We were like, wow, people are walking around and they smile at us, and you could see it now. Whereas in New York, there's just this atmosphere of misery, and you don't get to see people's expressions, and it does matter. The people who say it doesn't, I don't get it. The people who say wearing masks is not a big deal, of course it's a big deal. And I do it, and I make my family do it, but it's absolutely a big deal that we can't gauge other people's reactions right now. It's a big deal for kids, especially who can't, who read faces and can't do that right now. And also in New York, again, kids are just treated so bizarrely. My 5-year-old has to wear a mask and social distance at recess at his school, at a school that he attends 2 to 3 times a week at most, while outside. And in Florida, we just saw recess outside, and the kids are playing without a mask because that makes sense, and their case numbers are lower than ours. So it's really proving out.
Right, and I totally agree with you, Carol, because I feel the same way. I wear one when I'm in a situation where it's safer to wear one, but if I'm in a field by myself, I don't see the point. And you do see people who wear them in their cars when they're alone. It's becoming very psychological. Yeah. My next thing I wanted to bring up, because I liked this story about Rich Azzopardi, a senior advisor to Cuomo. He was not happy with the comparison numbers. Can you explain to people what happened? So New York decided to close the restaurants and Florida didn't. And when the case numbers came out, it kind of seemed like it wasn't as helpful in New York as they thought it was going to be.
Right. So indoor dining in New York closed in December, right before the holidays, which is their highest season. So it was particularly painful for restaurant owners. And Cuomo's advisor has defended this policy, even though Cuomo himself said that on the day that he closed indoor dining, he said that restaurants were only responsible for about 1.4% of COVID spread. In Florida, they made the decision to keep restaurants open, and they have a flourishing society because of it. And all of their businesses are open, and their schools are open full-time. And in New York, we're struggling. And yesterday, Governor Cuomo has the gall to come out and say, we need to open up because if we wait for the vaccine for everybody to be vaccinated, we might have nothing left to open up. Well, I've been saying those exact words since April. And for him to now say this as if somebody else is in charge is really galling.
No, totally. And his senior advisor, when he saw the numbers, because you point out that Florida's policies bore good fruit. On January 9th, New York reported 17,839 new cases. Florida, with about 2 million more people than New York, had 15,445. So his advisor says, rather than say, listen, maybe Andrew Cuomo was wrong about this, maybe we didn't need to kill all these businesses, he accuses Florida of cooking the books.
Yeah, which is absurd. And by all measures, Florida has absolutely had good COVID data. And beyond that, as I say later in the piece, even if you believe some crazy conspiracy theory that Florida's hiding their COVID numbers, you can't hide bodies. And Florida has had significantly fewer deaths than New York. And that's absolutely a fact. And that's related to the fact that they have prioritized older people, the people who are actually at risk, while New York continues to do crazy things, and it's just showing up again in the vaccine process.
And there's also an element that you point out later in your article about trust, the level of trust they had in Florida that their citizens would know to do the right thing. And there's no trust in New York. They have to demand people act a certain way. Karol, I also wanted to ask you, you have another story in the New York Post where you talk about the lessons we all probably tried to learn from this very bizarre year that just passed. I want to ask you about one because I've been thinking the same exact thing. You said the pandemic was a reckoning for relationships. Which friends did we most miss? It was a social do-over. Can you explain that a little bit?
I've seen so many friendships and marriages fall out during the pandemic, and in a lot of ways, it kind of brought things to a head. I think a lot of friendships and relationships could have lasted perhaps past the pandemic and a few years later, but all of this would have happened anyway. And I think the pandemic was a clarifier. Whoever you call your best friend, if that wasn't the first person you wanted to see when you were able to, perhaps they weren't your best friend, and a lot of feelings got hurt that way. But I think it really exposed a lot, and people should kind of look at that as a positive. As it might hurt right now, but at least you know right now who's important to you and who's not, and to whom you're important and who doesn't treat you like you're important.
Yeah, one of my best friends made this same point, and she said that a lot of times she felt like she had to have these meetups with people. You know those friends you meet up with like once or twice a year, and it's kind of the obligatory. It's like you have this obligation. Okay, I'm going to meet up with so-and-so. We're going to sit down. And when the pandemic happened, you kind of realized, listen, if I get a small sliver of time where I'm allowed out and I can sit down at a restaurant and I only have 6 people at the table, that person's not making the cut. And that might not be a bad thing.
That's right. That's right. And it, again, I agree. It's not a bad thing. I think that we should all know where we stand, and that's not a bad thing to find out. The pandemic, it really showed us who was important to us. I know that for myself, I kept reaching for my extended family over and over again. And we always saw each other a lot, but when it was like you can only see so many people, I wanted to be with my brother, my sister-in-laws, and my in-laws and my mom, etc., more than I wanted anything else. So it proved some things out for us.
A social do-over. Guys, Karol Markowicz is fantastic. She writes for the New York Post. She writes for Spectator. Check out her stuff. Follow her on Twitter at Karol, Karol. Karol, how did you get that Twitter handle? That is amazing. I'm
early adapter.
Yes, I'm envious. Let's hope you keep it and big tech doesn't ban you. But thank you, Karol, so much for coming on the show. Guys, we have so much more to get to when we get back. And we, of course, have Howie Carr calling us to tell us everything he's going to be talking about on the show. That was Karol Markowicz on The Grace Curley Show, and we will be right back.
The Grace Curley Show will be right back.